Hey everyone, welcome back. Let me ask you something. What would you do if the person you trusted the most shattered your heart into pieces? Would you give them a second chance, or walk away for good? Well, today's story is about a man who faced that exact dilemma. A husband who believed in love, in loyalty, until he discovered a betrayal that changed everything. Let's get into it. Mark and Sophie had been married for 8 years, and for the most part, life had been good. Mark always believed they shared something special, a bond built on trust, love, and years of memories. He wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed his marriage. Sophie had been his best friend long before she became his wife, and he never imagined a world where she wasn't by his side. They had met in college, fallen in love quickly, and built a life together. Through ups and downs, they had managed to stay strong. Mark worked a steady job, providing a comfortable home for them, while Sophie pursued her career, balancing work and their personal life effortlessly. She was charming, intelligent, and full of life, the kind of woman who could light up any room she walked into. Mark adored that about her. But lately, something felt off. Sophie had changed. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things, small shifts in her behavior that made Mark feel uneasy. She used to greet him warmly when he got home from work, wrapping her arms around him and asking about his day. But now, her greetings were distracted, sometimes just a nod or a half-hearted smile before she went back to whatever she was doing on her phone or laptop. At dinner, conversations that once flowed easily between them now felt forced. Sophie seemed preoccupied, often staring at her phone, lost in thought. When Mark asked her if something was wrong, she would brush it off, saying she was just tired or stressed from work. But Mark wasn't convinced. She had also started going out more. At first, it was just an occasional night out with her friends, but lately, it had become a regular thing. Just a girls' night, she would say. Mark didn't want to be the overprotective husband, so he never questioned her. He trusted her, at least, he thought he did. Then there were the late-night texts. He would catch glimpses of her phone screen lighting up at odd hours. When he casually asked who it was, she would quickly lock her phone and say, "Just a friend from work." Mark tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside him. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe Sophie was just going through a phase. After all, 8 years was a long time, relationships had their ups and downs. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And soon, he would find out just how right he was to be worried. It started with a simple observation, something so small that Mark almost didn't think twice about it. One night, as he lay in bed scrolling through his phone, he noticed Sophie's screen light up. She was turned slightly away from him, her back resting against the headboard, but he could still see the glow of her phone reflecting on her face. She was smiling. A small, subtle smile, one she didn't even seem to realize was there. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she typed, then paused, waiting for a reply. A few seconds later, another message came in. Mark glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. "Sophie," he said, his voice calm but curious. She flinched slightly before locking her phone and turning toward him, her expression neutral. Who are you texting this late?" She hesitated. Just for a moment. It was brief, but Mark caught it. Then she let out a small laugh and shook her head. "Oh, it's just work stuff," she said, placing her phone face down on the nightstand. "You know how it is. My team is working on a big project, and some of them have weird schedules." Mark nodded slowly. That made sense. Sophie's job in marketing often required late hours, and he had never had a reason to doubt her before. Still, something felt off. The way she had locked her phone so quickly. The hesitation before she answered. The way she was smiling at her screen, as if she were enjoying the conversation a little too much. Trying not to sound suspicious, he asked, "Everything okay at work?" "Yeah, of course," she said, pulling the blanket over herself. "It's just been a little stressful lately." Mark didn't press further. He didn't want to come across as paranoid. But that night, as Sophie drifted off to sleep, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His gut was telling him something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Sophie was constantly on her phone, always texting someone. She never left it unattended anymore. If she got up to use the bathroom, the phone went with her. If she was in the kitchen, it was either in her hand or within reach on the counter. Mark started to test her reactions. One evening, while they were watching TV, Sophie's phone buzzed on the couch beside her. Before she could grab it, Mark reached over. "I'll hand it to you," he said casually. But Sophie's reaction was anything but casual. She snatched it up before he could touch it, her face stiffening for just a second. "It's nothing," she said quickly, tucking it into her pocket. That was the moment Mark knew something was definitely wrong. "Sophie," he said carefully, turning toward her. "Is there something you're not telling me?" She frowned, acting confused. "What are you talking about? You've been glued to your phone lately. You won't let me near it. And now you're acting defensive." She sighed dramatically. "Mark, come on. You're being paranoid. It's just work stuff. I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this." "Then let me see." The words were out before he could stop them. He hadn't planned on asking, but the tension inside him had been building, and now it had spilled over. Sophie's expression changed instantly. For a moment, he saw something flash in her eyes, panic, maybe? But it was gone in a second, replaced by irritation. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "I can't believe you don't trust me. My phone is private, Mark. I don't go through your things, do I?" Mark exhaled, trying to stay calm. "I'm not asking to invade your privacy. I just need to know if there's something I should be worried about." Sophie shook her head, grabbing her phone and standing up. "You're being ridiculous." "I don't have time for this," she muttered before walking out of the room. Mark watched her leave, his stomach twisting into knots. She had never acted this way before. And that scared him more than anything. At first, Mark tried to shake off the uneasy feeling growing inside him. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe Sophie was really just busy with work. But the more he tried to convince himself, the more his doubts grew. Sophie had started coming home late, later than usual. It began with small excuses, a last-minute meeting, a project deadline, a client call that ran over. Mark wanted to believe her. He really did. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. One night, she walked through the door almost 3 hours later than she normally would. Mark had already eaten dinner alone, something that was becoming more common these days. She set her purse down, stretched, and let out a tired sigh. "Long day?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. She nodded, kicking off her heels. "Yeah, the client presentation took forever." Mark forced a smile, but something gnawed at him. "You didn't text or call," he said. "I was getting worried." Sophie sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mark, I don't need to check in with you every second. Work is unpredictable sometimes." That stung. She had never spoken to him like that before. But instead of pushing the issue, he just nodded and let it go. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Mark rolled over to kiss her goodnight. That's when he smelled it, a scent that didn't belong to her. It was perfume, but not hers. Not the soft floral fragrance she always wore. This one was different, heavier, musky, and unfamiliar. He pulled back slightly, his heart pounding. "You smell different," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Sophie blinked, then let out a small laugh. "Oh, must be from the office. One of the women I work with was testing perfumes, and I guess it rubbed off on me." Mark didn't respond. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she was telling the truth. Or maybe it was someone else's scent. For the first time in their marriage, Mark felt something he had never felt before: doubt. The next few days only made things worse. Sophie's behavior continued to change. She was more distant, constantly distracted, and always guarding her phone like a secret treasure. One evening, while doing laundry, Mark picked up one of Sophie's blouses from the hamper. That same scent hit him again, the unfamiliar perfume. And this time, there was something else. A faint smudge of red on the collar. His heart pounded in his chest. Lipstick? No, it couldn't be. Maybe it was just makeup from her own routine. He wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that. But deep down, his gut was screaming at him, something was very, very wrong. Mark sat on the couch, staring at Sophie's phone resting on the coffee table. She had just gone into the bathroom for a shower, leaving it behind, a rare occurrence. Normally, she kept it with her at all times, as if guarding it. But tonight, she had been in a rush, tossing it onto the table without thinking. His hands felt clammy as he picked it up. His heart pounded in his chest. Was he really about to do this? He had never gone through Sophie's phone before. He had always believed that trust was the foundation of their marriage. But trust wasn't enough anymore. Not when the late nights, the secrecy, and the unfamiliar perfume had all added up to a feeling he couldn't shake. His thumb hovered over the screen. The phone was locked, but he knew Sophie's passcode. She had given it to him long ago, back when secrets didn't exist between them. With a deep breath, he entered the numbers. The screen unlocked. For a moment, he hesitated. A part of him wanted to put the phone down, pretend everything was fine, and go back to being the trusting husband he had always been. But the other part, the part drowning in suspicion and fear, needed to know the truth. He opened her messages. At first, everything seemed normal. Conversations with friends, coworkers, family. But then, he saw a name that made his stomach drop. Ryan. He clicked on the thread. The moment he saw the messages, his worst fears were confirmed. Ryan, I can still feel you on me. Ryan, last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about it. Sophie, stop, you're going to get me in trouble. Ryan, you love the risk, don't you? Sophie, maybe, but we have to be careful. He's starting to ask questions. Mark felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. His hands tightened around the phone as he scrolled further. More messages. More flirtation. Hints of stolen moments. Ryan, when can I see you again? Sophie, soon. I'll make something up. Ryan, can't wait to have you in my arms again. Mark's vision blurred as rage, heartbreak, and betrayal crashed into him all at once. This wasn't just some harmless conversation. This wasn't just a mistake. This was an affair. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted for 8 years, was sneaking around behind his back. Lying to him. Running into another man's arms while he sat at home, worried about her. The sound of the shower turning off snapped him out of his daze. He quickly put the phone back, exactly where she had left it, and leaned back against the couch, his fists clenched. Sophie stepped out of the bathroom a few moments later, her hair damp, a towel wrapped around her body. She smiled at him as she walked past. "What are you watching?" she asked casually. Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. His entire world had just shattered, and she had no idea he knew. For the first time in his marriage, he looked at his wife and saw a stranger. Mark spent the next few days in a fog of anger, heartbreak, and confusion. The texts had confirmed what his gut had been telling him all along: Sophie was having an affair. But knowing wasn't enough. He needed proof. He needed to hear her admit it. So, he waited. He watched her more closely than ever, paying attention to every little detail. And as painful as it was, the signs were everywhere. The constant texting. The sudden urgency to leave the house. The extra care she took in her appearance before heading out. Then, one evening, she made a mistake. Sophie had gone to take a shower again, just like before, leaving her phone on the nightstand. This time, Mark didn't hesitate. He picked it up and took screenshots of the messages, sending them to his own email. Then he checked her photos. His heart clenched when he saw a selfie, Sophie in a dimly lit restaurant, wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, smiling at someone behind the camera. That was all he needed. By the time Sophie stepped out of the shower, Mark was already sitting on the bed, her phone in his hand. She stopped in her tracks, eyes narrowing. "What are you doing with my phone?" Mark didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Finally, he spoke. "Who's Ryan?" Sophie stiffened. It was barely noticeable, but Mark caught it. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his voice calm but ice cold. "Who is Ryan?" She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "Mark, you're being ridiculous." "Don't," he cut her off. "Don't lie to me." He turned the phone toward her, showing her the messages. Her own words staring back at her. "I know, Sophie. I know everything." The color drained from her face. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Then, just as quickly, she straightened her posture, trying to regain control. "You went through my phone?" she snapped. "That's a huge invasion of privacy." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Privacy? Are you seriously talking to me about privacy when you've been sneaking around behind my back?" Sophie crossed her arms. "It's not what you think." Mark clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. "Really? Because it looks like you've been sleeping with another man while I've been sitting here like an idiot, worrying about you." Sophie's face twisted with panic. "Mark, please. It was just a mistake." Her voice cracked, and suddenly, the anger in her expression was gone, replaced with desperation. "I swear, it didn't mean anything." Mark stared at her, his chest tight. "A mistake?" His voice was quieter now, but just as sharp. "You don't accidentally text someone about sneaking around. You don't accidentally meet up in secret. This wasn't a mistake, Sophie. It was a choice." Over and over again. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I was lonely," she whispered. "You've been so distant lately. We've been stuck in the same routine. I didn't mean to hurt you, I got caught up in something I couldn't stop." Mark shook his head, feeling his stomach twist. "So it's my fault now? Is that what you're saying?" "No. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Her face crumbled. "Please, Mark. I love you. I don't want to lose you." Mark let out a slow breath, his heart breaking all over again. "You already lost me, Sophie." For the first time in 8 years, he wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Sophie sat across from him, eyes red and filled with tears, her body trembling as she clutched a tissue in her hands. "I don't know how to fix this," Mark finally said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I don't even know if it can be fixed. Sophie sniffled. It can. I'll do anything, Mark. Please, just don't give up on us. He lifted his head, looking at her, really looking at her. The woman he had loved for 8 years. The woman he had built a life with. The same woman who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. And yet, he still loved her. That was the hardest part. He wanted to hate her, to walk away and never look back. But his heart wouldn't let him. This has to stop, he said firmly. Right now. If there's even a chance of fixing this, you need to prove it to me. Sophie nodded frantically. I will. Anything. Mark exhaled, steadying himself. Then here's how this is going to work. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. You're going to cut all contact with Ryan. Right now. No excuses, no delays. She didn't hesitate. I will. I swear. I want to see you do it, he added. Call him. End it. And I want to hear every word. Sophie swallowed hard, hesitating for just a second before reaching for her phone. Mark watched as she unlocked it, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. Then she pressed the call button. A few seconds passed before Ryan answered. Hey, beautiful, his voice came through the speaker, smooth and confident. Mark's stomach twisted. Sophie inhaled sharply before speaking, her voice strained. Ryan, this has to stop. There was silence on the other end. Then Ryan chuckled. Come on, don't do this over the phone. Let's talk in person. No, she said more firmly this time. I can't see you again. This was a mistake. I love my husband. I need to fix my marriage. Mark clenched his fists, watching her carefully. Ryan sighed. Sophie, you don't mean that. Yes, I do, she said quickly. It's over. Without waiting for a response, she ended the call and blocked his number. Then, just to prove it, she deleted the entire conversation thread. She turned to Mark, tears in her eyes. It's done. Mark nodded, but his heart remained heavy. This isn't just about ending things with him, he said after a moment. You have to prove to me that I can trust you again. Because right now, I don't. Sophie wiped her face. I will, Mark. Whatever it takes. He studied her, looking for any sign of dishonesty. No more lies, he said finally. No more hiding things from me. If I even suspect you're keeping secrets again, I'm gone. Sophie nodded desperately. I understand. Silence filled the room. A heavy, painful silence. Mark wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that this was just a terrible mistake, a lapse in judgment, something they could somehow move past. But deep down, a small voice in his head whispered something different. What if it's only a matter of time before she does it again? Mark wanted to believe her. He really did. When Sophie broke down, swearing it was over, promising to cut Ryan off completely, he saw a glimpse of the woman he had fallen in love with. A part of him clung to the hope that their marriage could still be saved. But doubt had already settled in his mind like a poison, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, it wouldn't go away. At first, things seemed to improve. Sophie was more attentive, making an effort to talk to him, to show she cared. She even left her phone out in the open again, as if trying to prove she had nothing to hide. But something still felt wrong. It was in the little things. The way she checked her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes when she reassured him. The way she'd disappear into another room for calls, claiming it was work. Mark told himself he was just being paranoid. But then, she started coming home late again. One evening, After Sophie left for what she claimed was a dinner with coworkers, Mark sat in their bedroom, staring at the clock. He had a choice. He could sit there, hoping she was telling the truth. Or he could find out for himself. His hands tightened around his car keys. He already knew what he had to do. Mark parked a few spaces away from the restaurant Sophie had mentioned. His heart pounded as he scanned the parking lot. Her car wasn't there. She lied. He felt sick as he gripped the steering wheel. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to stay calm. Think, Mark. Where would she be? Then it hit him. Ryan. He pulled out his phone and quickly searched for nearby hotels. There were a few in the area, but one stood out, a quiet, upscale place just outside of town. He didn't want to believe she would go that far. But at this point, nothing would surprise him. Mark drove there as fast as he could without losing control. His mind raced, torn between wanting to catch her and praying he was wrong. When he pulled into the parking lot, his stomach dropped. There it was, Sophie's car. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to turn around. He wanted to drive home and pretend he never saw this. But something inside him refused to back down. He got out of the car. Every step toward the hotel felt heavier than the last. His pulse roared in his ears. Inside, the lobby was quiet, dimly lit. Mark scanned the check-in counter, but no one was paying attention to him. Then, just as he was about to turn toward the elevator, he saw them. Sophie and Ryan. They stepped out of the elevator together, laughing softly, their bodies close. Ryan's hand brushed against her lower back, and she didn't pull away. Mark couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. It was real. Everything inside him shattered. His wife, the woman who had sworn she'd never betray him again, was still lying to him. Sophie suddenly glanced up, and for a brief second, their eyes met. Her smile disappeared. Her face drained of color. She knew. She knew she had been caught. Ryan looked between them, confused. "Who's this?" he asked. Sophie didn't answer. She just stood there, frozen, guilt written all over her face. Mark's fists clenched at his sides. His whole body trembled, not just with anger, but with pain. He had given her a chance. He had been willing to forgive. But now? Now, there was nothing left to save. Mark sat in his car, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The photos he had just taken, the ones of Sophie and Ryan leaving the hotel together, were staring back at him, confirming what he already knew. She never stopped. She had looked him in the eyes, promised him she'd change, sworn she'd never betray him again. And yet, here they were. His chest burned with rage, but beneath the anger was something worse, heartbreak. He couldn't go home. Not yet. He needed more. He needed to be absolutely sure there was no way she could twist this, no excuse she could make. So, he waited. From a distance, he watched as Sophie and Ryan got into their separate cars. Ryan left first. Sophie stayed a little longer, probably checking her phone, maybe even texting Mark, pretending she had just finished dinner with her coworkers. When she finally drove off, Mark followed her. Back home, she entered the house like nothing had happened. Mark stayed outside for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. This was it. When he stepped inside, Sophie turned, startled. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile. "You're home early." Mark didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with everything he was holding back. Then, slowly, he pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward her. Her smile faded. The first photo was of her and Ryan stepping out of the hotel. The next was Ryan's hand on her back. The final one, the one that made her gasp, was of their faces inches apart, laughing like two people without a single care in the world. Sophie's hands flew to her mouth. "Mark, No," he cut her off, his voice eerily calm. "No more lies, Sophie. No more excuses. I want the truth. All of it." Tears welled up in her eyes. Her lips trembled as she shook her head. "I was going to end it," she whispered. "I swear, I was. I made a mistake." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake?" He stepped closer, his voice shaking. "A mistake is forgetting to turn off the stove. A mistake is saying the wrong name in a conversation. This was a choice. Every text. Every secret meeting. Every lie you told me. All of it was a choice." Sophie sobbed, reaching for him, but he stepped back. "Mark, please. I love you. I never wanted to hurt you." Mark clenched his jaw. "You didn't just hurt me, Sophie. You destroyed me." She shook her head desperately. "We can fix this. We can go to therapy, we can." "No, Sophie. You don't get to decide that anymore." Her breath hitched as his words sank in. For the first time, she realized she had truly lost him. Mark took one last look at the woman he had loved for 8 years. The woman who had shattered his trust beyond repair. Then, in the coldest voice he had ever used, he said, "We're done." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sophie behind, sobbing and begging. But this time, he didn't look back. Mark wasted no time. The very next morning, he contacted a divorce lawyer. There was no doubt in his mind anymore, this marriage was over. As he sat in the lawyer's office, signing the initial paperwork, a strange mix of emotions washed over him. Sadness, anger, relief. 8 years, gone. But the woman he had married wasn't the same woman who had betrayed him. The Sophie he had loved was just a memory now. When he got home, he didn't say a word to her. He simply walked past her, grabbed a suitcase, and started packing. Sophie rushed into the bedroom, her eyes red and puffy. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't do this. We can fix this." He didn't even look at her. "We've already had this conversation." She reached for his arm, but he pulled away. "It was a mistake," she sobbed. "I was stupid, I was selfish, but I love you. I love us. Please don't throw everything away." Mark zipped up his suitcase and finally turned to face her. His expression was blank, but his eyes were cold. "You threw everything away, Sophie. Not me." Her face crumbled as she fell to her knees, begging. "I'll do anything. I'll cut off Ryan, I'll go to therapy, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, just please, don't leave me." But Mark had already left her. Emotionally, mentally. He grabbed his suitcase, walked to the door, and paused for only a moment. "The divorce papers will be sent soon," he said flatly. "Don't contact me again." Then he walked out, leaving Sophie sobbing on the floor. The next few weeks were a blur for Sophie. She tried to call him. Blocked. She texted him. Blocked. She emailed him. No response. She even drove to his temporary apartment, only to have him tell the front desk not to let her in. It was like she had never existed in his life. Like all those years together meant nothing. She was alone now. At first, she tried to distract herself, convincing herself he'd come back after some time. But he didn't. Then the reality of her choices began to set in. Mark wasn't just gone, he was done with her. Their home, the life they built, The security she had taken for granted, it was all slipping away. She had to move out of their house once the divorce process started. The place that had once been filled with warmth and love now felt cold and empty. Every room was a reminder of what she had destroyed. She lost friends, too. People who once admired her now looked at her with disappointment. Even her own family struggled to defend her actions. One night, she sat alone in her tiny apartment, scrolling through old photos of her and Mark. Tears blurred her vision. She had everything: a devoted husband, a beautiful home, a future. And she threw it all away.